The U.S. Constitution provides, as we all know, for three co-equal branches. Today, we're concerned about the chief executive, the President of the United States. As we know, the chief executive, the head of the executive branch, enforces the laws, appoints high-ranking officials, serves as commander-in-chief of our armed forces, can issue pardons, and can veto and advocate for legislation. But what are we to do when the president is incapable of performing these duties? Last June, the American public saw with their own eyes what many knew to be true, but would not dare to admit publicly. Our sitting commander-in-chief was suffering from severe cognitive decline, as evident by this video, which I will now show.
For what I've been able to do with the with the COVID, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare, wants to get rid of the ability of Medicare for us to be able to negotiate.
As we now know, there was a conspiracy to hide the president's true condition by his family, by his staff, by the media, and many elected officials. Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson, who co-authored a book entitled Original Sin, that book amounted to a mea culpa by the mainstream media, but they summed up the problem when they wrote this. Quote, "What the world saw at Joe Biden's one and only 2024 debate was not an anomaly. It was not a cold. It was not someone who was under or over prepared. It was not someone who was just a little tired. It was the natural result of an 81-year-old man whose capabilities had been diminishing for years. Biden, his family, and his team let their self-interest and their fear of another Trump term justify an attempt to put an at times addled old man in the Oval Office for 4 more years. So make no mistake about it, this was a constitutional crisis, bigger than President Biden, bigger than any single election, and one that cannot be absolved by the collective apology of the press and an election where the president's party lost. Current events, such as we are experiencing today in the Middle East, are a prime example of why we need a president with his full cognitive abilities, making important decisions involving war and peace. We should know, but we don't yet know, precisely what should happen when a president is unable to perform his or her constitutional duties. And that's the purpose of today's hearing. There are many unanswered questions from this scandal, questions that the authors of Original Sin failed to address in their book, questions that are foundational to the proper functioning of our government. We will address those here and shine a light on exactly what went on in the White House during the Biden presidency. We simply cannot ignore what transpired because President Biden is no longer in office. With a compromised president, our government's very legitimacy and capacity to function was undermined. The American people paid a price, from President Biden's handling of the border crisis to the disastrous events we saw unfold in Afghanistan. It's absolutely imperative that Congress grapple with these difficult questions, no matter how much our Democratic colleagues would like to simply sweep it under the rug. We need to know who was in charge during the last months of the Biden administration. Was it his wife, his chief of staff, nameless others? None of these people were elected by the American people, nor were they authorized by the Constitution and laws of the United States to carry out the duties of the President of the United States. The 25th Amendment provides a roadmap for succession in instances of presidential incapacity. Section 4 gives the Vice President and a majority of the President's cabinet the authority to challenge the President's ability to carry out the functions of his office subject to a vote in Congress. But in this instance, the Vice President and the cabinet, the very ones authorized by the 25th Amendment to question the President's capacity, they did nothing. Are there penalties when the when the cabinet and the Vice President refuse to carry out their duties under Section 4 of the 25th Amendment? Should there be more accountability? The framers of this amendment acknowledged that the execution of that amendment would depend on the good faith of the cabinet and the Vice President. But Biden's cabinet and the Vice President did not act in good faith. They acted in their political and personal self-interest. This is the great paradox of self-government. Many of the rules, traditions, and institutions that sustain our republic are self-enforcing. The health and legitimacy of our democratic republic rests on the character of the men and women who serve in government. As a government, it is imperative that we have clear contingency plans when emergency strikes. And yes, it is an emergency when we have a sitting president who's unable to discharge the duties of that office. The concerns raised by this incident stretch far beyond the bounds of partisan politics. I will note that few of my Democratic colleagues are here today. Thank you to Senator Welch from Vermont for being here, leaving us with no other option than to take the boycotting of this hearing as an admission of guilt for their role in this crisis. We must not turn away from the search for answers, and it is not an overstatement to say that the future of our country could one day hinge on how we choose to act or not act on this very issue. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this morning as we examine the difficult but necessary questions that must be answered from this monumental scandal.
The title of the hearing, Unfit to Serve, captures a sobering and undeniable truth. President Biden was mentally unfit to carry out the responsibilities of the most powerful office in the world. Given his mental incapacity, the American people deserve to know who was running the country the last 4 years. Today, as we seek to answer this question, it is deeply disappointing but not surprising that most Democrats on this committee have chosen to all but boycott the hearing and have failed to call a single witness. They have chosen to ignore this issue like they ignored President Biden's decline. Their absence speaks volumes, an implicit admission that the truth is too inconvenient to face. By refusing to engage in this critical examination, they abdicate their responsibility to the American people. This de facto boycott is not just a refusal to participate, it's a refusal to serve the American people who deserve answers about who is truly leading their government. President Biden's decline did not suddenly begin in June of 2024. It was a persistent and obvious truth that was evident for years to anyone who was willing to see it. This reality did not require special insider knowledge or investigative reporting to uncover. We didn't need Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson to tell us what millions of Americans could freely observe with their own eyes. The truth was glaringly obvious. Anyone who was paying attention could tell that the emperor had no clothes. On border policy, our nation's borders were handed over to the radical left-wing element of the administration, throwing open our borders to 15 million illegal aliens, an unprecedented immigration crisis that pulled our nation into chaos. On foreign policy, haphazard and reckless decisions placed our warfighters in jeopardy, escalated conflicts around the globe, and led to a catastrophic humiliation on the world stage that claimed the lives of 13 American soldiers, including one Missourian, during the disastrous withdrawal from Kabul. On the economy, rampant inflation drove up the cost of life's essentials, making them unaffordable to countless hardworking families. In the realm of culture, the regime censored free speech, closed down churches, targeted traditional Catholics and parents at school board meetings, and let an unelected class of left-wing radicals degrade, attack, and lie about our history and our heritage. A poisonous anti-Western, anti-American ideology that had once been confined to elite university classrooms suddenly became the official White House policy. All of this was done not in isolation. It was sustained, defended, and covered for by an alliance of elite institutions, from the media to the so-called expert class to big tech to the federal bureaucracy itself. When we speak of collusion among elites, or the so-called deep state, we're accused of being conspiracy theorists. But this was no theory. It was plain and overt, out in the open for everyone to see. For 4 years, we had a president who could barely string together coherent sentences after 6 p.m. Yet, this glaring fact went unreported, undiscussed, and unaddressed. Why? Because the Democrat Party, corporate media, federal bureaucracy, and big tech companies collaborated to conceal the truth from the American people, not out of ignorance, but because it advanced their own interests. In the absence of a functioning president, chaos took hold. An empty vessel occupying the Oval Office becomes a puppet for those surrounding him. Sean Spicer. Mr. Spicer served as the 30th White House press secretary, is the author of 4 best-selling books, and the host of The Sean Spicer Show. Mr. Spicer previously served as communications director and chief strategist of the Republican National Committee and worked for several members of Congress. He currently serves on the board of visitors of the U.S. Naval Academy, holds master's degrees from the U.S. Navy War College, and is in his 26th year of service in the U.S. Navy. Mr. Spicer is a native of Rhode Island and resides in Virginia. It is the tradition of this committee that all witnesses will be sworn in. If you'd please rise, I'll swear you in now. Raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Chairman Schmidt and Cornyn, members of the committee, thank you for having me. I was asked to share my experience as a senior White House staffer with respect to the interactions that I and other senior staff had with President Trump during his first term. During my tenure as press secretary, I interacted with the president multiple times every day. Most days I would talk to him by phone or in person early in the morning, and then multiple times throughout the day, including weekends. For the most senior positions in the White House, those designated by the rank of assistant to the president, which includes the White House chief of staff, the White House counsel, and the press secretary, it is critical to have regular interaction with the president. The position of press secretary especially demands this type of consistent and intentional communication. I or any other press secretary, regardless of administration, could not do the job effectively without regular communication with the president. It was my responsibility to have the most up-to-date understanding of President Trump's position on policy, personnel, and everything in between. Admittedly, I made a couple of rather high-profile mistakes during my tenure. You may have read some of them. But in all cases, those mistakes occurred when I wasn't connected with the president's thinking or position on a particular issue or policy. Coordinating and collaborating among even the most senior staff cannot replace direct communication with the president himself. In my position, I was very well acquainted with the president's work, his day-to-day responsibilities, and his fitness for office. I watched him serve with the strength and endurance of a man half his age. As you can see on almost a daily basis through events, statements, and social media posts, he's up early and ends his days very late. Yet in several instances during his first term, the media questioned his fitness for office. Guests and so-called experts like Sanjay Gupta at CNN were called upon to speculate on the result of Trump's physical and mental well-being. The Washington Post ran hit pieces with headlines like, "The White House struggles to silence talk of Trump's mental fitness." Vox wrote, "Is Trump mentally unfit to be president?" NBC ran a story by the Associated Press that raised mental health concerns regarding the president. CNN's Brian Stelter questioned if members of the news media were, quote, tiptoeing around obvious questions about President Trump's instability. These headlines were not isolated instances. Most major news outlets ran with these ridiculous type of propaganda pieces. To use one of the media's favorite terms, these inquiries were without evidence. That brings us to the juxtaposition of how the very same media covered the Biden administration. To be blunt, the legacy media failed the American people. They failed to do their job. Many, rightly so, believe the media in this country is culpable in covering up the obvious decline of the 46th president of the United States. The scrutiny that was baselessly directed at President Trump during his first term was wholly absent from the media coverage of the Biden White House. The media lacked any sense of curiosity that would naturally stem from what the public could see with their own eyes. Even in the face of deeply concerning and public signs of President Biden's mental and physical decline, legacy media outlets were silent. Biden and his senior aides flatly dismissed the need for a cognitive test during his tenure, as had been requested of President Trump. Yet no protest was heard from the voices that were so critical of Trump. With the exception of a couple White House reporters like Fox News Channel's Peter Doocy, reporters generally refused to breach the subject at White House briefings. News outlets weren't the only ones complicit in covering up Biden's decline. Presidential staff would have or should have been interacting with Biden on a daily basis. At best, his administration was grossly negligent. At worst, Biden's staff actively concealed his fitness for office. When White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre said President Biden could run circles on her, there were only two possible conclusions: that she herself was in poor health and in need of medical assistance, or that she was lying. There is no question that a vast difference between how President Trump interacted with his staff and how President Biden did. Whether one supports President Trump or not, he is clearly the most accessible and transparent president in modern history. And there is no question who is running this country. The same cannot be said of President Biden. It is the president who is elected by the American people. The role of staff is to execute his agenda and policies. I thank the committee for holding this hearing so that going forward, the American people can have the confidence in who is running the country and making critical decisions. The American people deserve no less.
Well, if you enjoyed this content, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and click the notification bell to get more.